Hey students, hey everyone. This is Professor Escobar, and I'm finally delivering the workshop that I gave to Chaucer's. Last Wednesday, I was invited to give a workshop about poetry and placemaking um, as it relates to Santa Barbara, even. Um, so what does that mean? Basically, Chaucer's is celebrating their 50th anniversary. They're our local bookstore on State Street, um, near Gelson's, and the post office, and they're really cool. They have a lot of you need to go there if you haven't. It's totally worth the field trip. I might even make it extra credit if you go take a selfie there, just because it is important as English majors, as writers, as thinkers, as students to know where to get books. Because when I was in school, in elementary and middle school, libraries and bookstores were the only place to get books. Now you can get books online, and now a lot of poetry is available online for free. The only thing I'll say about that before I forget is that keep in mind that poets don't usually cultivate an online presence. Some do, but many don't. They just are truly starving artists trying to get by. And so the poems that get published online for free may not even give you a real sense of the poets who they are in their books. So I highly recommend reading it's a book of poetry to get to know who a poet is. Often their favorite poems and the most influential poems are not published for free online. It's like, why give your best shit away? You know? All right. So Chaucer's books, pretty great. They actually carried one of my books uh, when it came out, and they're just a really important part of the community here in Santa Barbara. So bookshops, community centers, libraries, universities, they they put on these things called workshops, which are like master classes or kind of one-off specialty courses, one-time specialty courses where you can learn specific skills or get access to specific resources. In this case, I'm teaching people how to write about place and educating them on how different poets have written about place. All right, so I'll kind of go over like the different parts of the workshop and okay, so and sorry, I have all these windows open. And then I'll actually go through the workshop itself. So I I'm really happy. I'm like way too happy to kind of be like a floating head on a screen. But and here we are. Okay, let me see if I want to don't want to be in front of things. All right. Um, how do influencers do this? Okay, so oh my God, this is so annoying. All right. One of the things that's funny about this is that I used to teach the X-Men, a comic, 1981 or 1983 edition of the X-Men, the same um series as the remake that you see on Disney Plus that's really popular, um, featuring Rogue and Gambit as the main protagonists. In one of the panels, Professor Xavier is a pink floating head, and I joked with my students that one day that's a giant pink floating head. And this was before the pandemic, and lo and behold, I am a giant pink floating head speaking into the void of online teaching. All right, so let's get this bad boy cracking. All right, so for this poetry workshop, you'll see that I I put together a annotated bibliography or just a list of recommended readings for this workshop. Of course, as soon as this is required reading. Um, and it's meant to kind of be like a master class. So it's just like I want to give you enough for you to continue this work for the rest of your for years to come, honestly, years to come. That's how this is a very advanced course on how I put it together, which didn't go well with everyone. I mean, everyone liked it when I did the workshop, but I talked almost the whole freaking time. So I talked for like 2 hours, which is nice to do on Zoom, but it's not very good to do in person. Anyways, all right, so this annotated bibliography goes over the 30 something resources, poems that are in the packet, and um, poems, even poems and writings that are not in the packet. So some of them are seminal novels and seminal books of essays that you might find online for free, pirated somewhere, or digitally downloaded, or but yeah, anyways, so what I would like you to do is after the workshop, read through all the notes, and then I'll actually ask you. I'm gonna pull up the window. Oh, here it is. I'll actually ask you to then read all the poems in the packet. So there's about 70 something poems. All right, I'm trying to. Sorry, this is not in the right view that I want it to. Okay, let's. Okay, now it's in the view I want it to be in. Um, so yeah, digitally scanned 70 something pages for this workshop of rare poems and that have influenced my thinking about place. And so I want you, and they are in order as they appear in the notes. So I've taken a lot of time with this because in part I knew that if I didn't and the PDF was a shit show, no one would read it. So I've taken some time to make it pop, and so you can easily follow along with the guide and then the actual poems that I talk about. Of course, so in the notes, I also make a lot of um, comments and observations that I don't actually include in the workshop. All right. So let's get cracking on this workshop, bro. All right. I'm in my feral professor phase, in case you're wondering why. It's also 9:15 and I'm really tired and I can't wait. So but I'm also really excited to share this all with you. All right. So poetry at place workshop. Let's get started for this workshop. All right. So if you go and I have in my little matching notebook a little preamble to the workshop. If you go to any library, any bookstore, like Chaucer's, and you pull any poetry collection off the shelf, you will find at least one poem about love in that poetry book. You will also find one poem, at least one poem, usually about a place, usually a very specific place. That is to say, like love, put place and writing about place is one of the principal subjects of poetry. Um, the poets we'll be reading today have written about Negro Mountain it's a name of a mountain range in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, Slot Canyon in Borrego Springs, California, the head of Japan in the 17th century, Oakland after the 2016 election, Santa Barbara, California in the late 1800s. Other poets and writers explore imaginary places, like El Hoyo in which is an imaginary community created of different Chicano communities in the American Southwest after the Second World War, in the post-war period. A mythical living planet. So in one of the books that we'll be reading from today, um, there's a planet that's alive, that's actual creature. Oxnard in the future, where it is a launching pad to outer space and adventures. The ruinous neighborhoods of pre-urban Neza, a neighborhood in the Mexico City, and then a fabulated um, dystopian underworld of the Lower East Side, and then as a fairy tale Fresno version of Fresno, California, which is in the Central Valley. And the Lower East Side is a very important neighborhood in as all neighborhoods are in New York City, but in this one is in Manhattan. Tonight we'll look at different approaches about place in different genres, including epic poetry, cinema verite, travel logs, language poetry, beat poetry, dreams, environmental and urban planning. We'll do different exercises, some that will begin tonight in the company of other poets, and some you'll complete, and others you'll never complete in a good way out in the world, in the real world, as they say. So we're doing readings of different genres, and we're completing exercises tonight. Our goal tonight is to explore the countless ways, and the key word being explore, that there are to write about a place and to equip you with some techniques and resources to continue on this poetically endless project. Just as you would have to stop the world to stop the feeling, just as you would have to stop the world to stop people from writing love poems, there would be no poetry without Memphis, without San Francisco, without Florence, without the Indian subcontinent, without Tokyo, without the District of Columbia, without Brooklyn, so on and so forth. So this slide is just a little introduction about myself. I published one book of poetry. It's of concrete and experimental poetry. About in And then I've published two chapbooks, and then I've also published two magazines. All right, my debut novel is coming out later this year. So if you want to, there's some information about that, and it's about the Inland Empire, where I'm from in Southern California. And I also note that I have a BA in urban planning, so I majored in urban planning in addition to English as an undergraduate. And I mentioned that not to recite my CV, but to say like when it comes to plays and poetry, it's been a deep interest of mine since I was in your shoes. I majored in poetry, and then I also went to poetry reading all the time. I majored in poetry. I majored in English, and I majored in urban planning. I did a double major, something I recommend all students doing, especially in different fields in different schools. And then I also I tried to do engineering, and then I tried to do architecture, and then I dumbed it down to urban planning as a joke. Actually, really happy that I did urban planning. And so I kind of have a rich theoretical foundation for traditions outside of poetry of writing and thinking about place. All right. So poetry of place. So let's begin with some important kind of ideas about place. So what do poets say about the subject of place? And I'll just read some quotes that I think are important. Poetry is a refuge. It gives us another way of breathing. Solida Rios. Solida Rios. So that's interesting. So this, for me, this quote connects poetry and like or poetics, how poetry is written, and place with the idea of breath. It's like literally us consuming a place and being consumed by a place. Because I know that time is always time and place is always and only place. T.S. Eliot. And this one I've thought about for like years. So I give it to you for you to think about for years on, sporadically over years, not for years at and do nothing else. The dreams people have in a place should be recorded, like local history. Robert Kelly. The world has to be changed from deep within its interior, the place where its secrets are held. And what better way than poetry, the art form that offers the most immediate access to interiority. So here, Carmen illustrates the relationship between place and poetry. And then this one is a little theoretical. Can a comparative analysis of 20th century art and writing produced in this hemisphere belie distinct paradigms of degree and kind while also pointing toward a new model between the Americas? Roberto Tejada. So this, let me translate this. It's a little abstract. Um, this quote is kind of suggesting that by writing about a place and writing about art and writing of and literature of that place, we can actually relocate or resituate ourselves to other places. We can redefine our relationship to a place by through writing and through thinking. So we can kind of like metaphorically relocate ourselves in our relationship to others through art and writing about art. So what do you think of these? So these for this workshop, as it's online, I just want to pose some questions to you. You don't have to write anything down. What do these quotes make you think of? Are there any quotes you would add? And what is the relationship between poetry and place? Right. So think about those questions for a little bit, even after this workshop. So for this next part, we're going to actually look at how poets have actually written about place. So the techniques and the things that they do in their poems when they do write about place. So the first, this is kind of like a core lesson of all modern poetry. It's about breath. So why do, one second. Why do poems nowadays, they don't look like the poems of the past, right? They're pretty different. So why do poems nowadays like look like so different than like VNLs? Why do they look like this? Even you can glimpse it from um the difference, and it's immediate the impression of how different poetry is today than like Shakespearean poetry, let's say, or even Wordsworth. So one of the fundamental ideas of poetry after the 20th century, after World War II, after World War II, let's say, is the idea that you don't have to use one form to write a poem. Many of you have probably heard of free verse, but do you know where that idea comes from? So it comes from Charles Olson, who is considered to be a genius, and I go, he was a widely influential post-war poet, and at one point he was asked to lead the Democratic National Convention. He turned him down, saying that he thinks he could make more of a contribution by focusing on poetry. And he wrote a number of poems and essays about projective verse, which we know today as more commonly as free verse. So, what does it mean, free verse? What are some of the rules? Is it really totally free? That's for you to determine. But Olson breaks it down for us. He says that, and so he's writing in response to World War II, which I believe he served in. How do you create beauty in a world destroyed by war? In a world constantly destroyed by war? In a world where technology has continues to undermine what it means to be human and our basic needs? Well, a lot of artists thought and responded to this. And Olson, and one of the responses to that was free verse. Villanelles and sonnets and haikus, while they're beautiful, don't move us like they do. You can think about it this way. When was the last time someone read you a sonnet? All right. Um, Instead, so in a world destroyed and constantly destroyed by war, how do you create things that are beautiful? So Olson's like, well, you don't use any one form. Instead, you are allowed to change form throughout a poem as you need, as needed. But what drives that change? The subject. What you're writing about will inspire or teach or shape how the poem looks. So the subject of the poem determines the shape and the form of the poem. That's what he means by breath. So poems are not created just with language, they're created by images. You can think of these as postcards, but poems ask us to imagine different things, like Amanda Gorman's poem, like all the things that she asks us to think about when it comes to freedom and unity and hope. The images she gives us of the tree, of the Bible, of working together. Another concept core to free verse is musicality. What does he mean by Charles Olson mean by musicality? He means that when we move from literal meaning to figurative meaning or unfixed meaning, that's what poets live for. That's what's really exciting. So I can't play it because of copyright, but I will link it in our below. The Little Mermaid song. It's like kind of like the perfect example of this. Let me get my phone so I can read the lyrics. Because in that song is a really good example um of musicality. I So Ariel says, look at this stuff. Isn't it neat? Wouldn't you think my collection's complete? Wouldn't you think I'm the girl who has everything? Look at this trove, treasures untold. How many wonders can one cavern hold? Look around here, you think, sure, she's got everything. I've got gadgets and gizmos aplenty. I've got who's its and what's its galore. You want thingamabobs? I got 20. But who cares? Okay. So we get so musicality. What is a gadget and a gizmo? What is a who's its and what's its galore? What is a thingamabob? So that is what we mean by musicality in free verse is we move from literal meaning to unfixed or figurative meaning. if we had a whole poem of who's its and what's its galore, no one would know what we're talking about. Instead, the musicality is structured on having some literal meaning and then also figurative meaning. But as poets, we kind of live for this, like not of having language that is figurative and open to multiple interpretations. And then the last kind of principle of free verse is assemblage or collage. So it's the idea that you use multiple forms to create a poem, like much like you would cut and paste a collage. So it contains mixed language or found language, so language that's found in the world. So something I said when I gave this workshop at Chaucer's is as a poet, now that you are writing about place, if you see something beautiful, take out your phone and write it down. Write down what it is. Um, as we see later in this workshop, cinema verite filmmakers use technology to reawaken and reopen their understandings of the world. And they use technology to kind of expand what people thought of the world. So don't look at this as a distraction box. Think of it as a notepad, a notebook for helping you understand and think about the world. So poets also important to free verse is the idea of mixed language, and we'll get into this one a little later. It's a little complicated. Um, Actually, we'll get into it right now. I have my stack of books behind the computer. So this is a really interesting. So what is mixed lang So what is mixed language? Mixed language is when you use two different kinds of language in a poem. Okay, what does that mean, professor? Well, you know how your parents talk? That's different from how other people talk, right? That is a kind of language, the language of being a mom or being a dad. You know how doctors talk, you know how professors talk. Well, that's its own language, the language of being a professor or the language of being a doctor. You know how, so you can think of these as like love languages. Different kinds of languages like love, it's more similar of a concept to like what love languages are, expressing how things are expressed. Um, this will make more sense when we look at an example. So let's look at the poem Life in Gomorrah by Roberto Santiago. Life in Gomorrah. So this you have to know the biblical reference. So Sodom and Gomorrah, there was a guy, Lot and Lot's wife, who fled a city of sin. And as they're fleeing, they were given one instruction, don't look back. And Lot's wife looks back and was turned into a pillar of salt. So that's the biblical story. And so this poet does a revision of that story. Life in Gomorrah. At one time, Lot's wife and I were best friends. We would walk around for miles without shoes, building sandcastles between our toes and naming stars. A rebel in her bones, I called her Eddie, the stone. She never took no for an answer. She was brash. Eddie hated that I called her the stone. Every time I said it, she would roll her eyes. Whenever she spoke, she tore the air, invoking auras to plash and surge in her wake. Eddie loved Lot as much as a wife like her could. She asked too many questions. She often took no as a challenge. She walked with her head towards the sun. Eddie stared through the sun, never away. On the evening when it was about to happen, she shared the warning with me, escape, forward. I should have remained. Eddie saved me from the brim and smite, stone and flame, and everything else the writers added for color. They painted Lot a hero, his wife with no name, but looked back and pillar and salt. I was behind her. So the mixed language, here he's mixing the language of what would you say the languages are in this poem? One is the biblical language, right? He's using biblical imagery and biblical words found in the Bible and phrases, and he's mixing that with the language of friendship, the language of besties. The language besties use would to describe their actions and just those kinds of things. So that's mixed language. All right. So one of the forms that poets have used to describe play. So this is like a foundational concept of all poems that we're going to look at today. So poets have often engaged with place through myth. So you can think of the Odyssey, you can think of oral histories, detective fiction, Sadia Hartman's work where you're creating imaginary stories, but about using real archival materials. You can think of lore and fairy tales as creating a universe that's in evokes a certain place. And so when it comes to myth, I throw this in there here because it's important to think about, or one of the things that poets are doing is they're kind of saying, like with a epic poetry, we're creating a unique form for this place. This place that we're going to is so different that we're going to need a new form of poetry to imagine it. So we can see this in a modern book length epic of Alice Notley's The Descent of Alet. So I'll just read I'll let you read it. I'm a little winded and I don't want this to go too long. Um but The Descent of Alet, I guess I'll read a couple stanzas that can't hurt, right? A while before I entered the subway, all money underground, became diseased. It seared your skin when you touched it and poisoned your bloodstream. Within days, you would die. Thus, all money was taken by, by people in special suits and burned. No more was issued here below. So money became invisible. Invisible money became began to change hands, paid in invisible, things paid for by invisible. Everyone knows. If you have it or not, if you have enough or not, all is exactly as before when there was money, except if it isn't seen, but it is money, just the same. Thus, there was a woman who kept trying to leave the subway. She was pointed out to me at a station. In the process of trying to leave us, a young woman, cruelly headed, with a slightly loony look, encased in a large plastic container. People wear them when they leave here. She passed through the turnstile, the other side of the turnstile, being obscured to us as if everything on that side were somehow blurred for us. Here we viewed by us myoptically, I wouldn't see exactly what happened. Movement of figures. Then she was returned to us, sent back through in the plastic. They never let me leave. I get my plastic, I get my money, but they always turn me back. There's always something wrong with my money. Usually they say it is not enough, though it always is. This time they said it was too old. I must have saved it too long. Old money isn't used anymore above the ground. What do you want? Why do you want so much to go there? I asked. Anyone does, she said fiercely. I surprised myself by saying with conviction, I don't. All right. So these mythical poetry, epic poetry is um it uses new forms, and you'll see in the packet how this visually looks on the page. and it's kind of creating a new form. And with these kinds of poems, one thing to remember is that you they create new forms, but there's a lot of repetition involved in the form. And in minimalism, this is called bivariance, bivariance. So you create patterns based off of uh, developing a form, a shape, and then repeating it and slightly altering that form. So here she has like the unit of like quoted words. So it has the effect of speech. And she's able to kind of use this unit, this very unique unit throughout the poem to describe her going into the underworld of New York. Um, Science fiction also is something to think about too, where and I when it comes to writing and thinking about place, I mention all this because as poets, we know that place is um, geological events plus belief. So here in Santa Barbara, we experience a lot of natural disasters, sometimes around year round. Um, and some of us have been affected by this acutely. But we understand that geography is not a fixed thing. There's the event of the land, being born from the sea, the event of the fires, of mudslides, of gentrification, of tourism. We These geographic and cultural events shape what a place is. The another thing I want to point out about this is that myth allows us to engage with belief, the things that are believed about a place. And by creating our own myths, we can be in deep conversation about what is believed about a place. So we see that in like the work of Saidiya Hartman. So I included a link to her actually reading from her book. So what she did is Saidiya Hartman is she researched for like 8 years the lives of young Black girls leaving the South in the decades after the end of slavery to move to cities in the urban North to pursue their dreams, and live lives as independent women, and created kind of modern life as we know it, of where people pursue love and their dreams, and they're just scraping by, making the most of the urban environment. So here in this book, she kind of creates narratives and stories about these women. And while the actual narratives are imagined and fabulated, um, the all the material that she uses and she cites is real. So just to give you effect of how powerful creating myths, and being fabulous with the facts can be as poets. I just want to read a little bit of this. And sometimes when I introduced this idea in the workshop, there was a little bit of pushback, and I would have the same pushback if I didn't, I totally understand it. As poets, we are not journalists. We're not journalists. We're not archivists. We're not researchers. We can be those things in addition to being a poet. But a poet can take a poem in the direction of life, not, and that may be different from established fact or contested realities. All right. So this I'll read the first two paragraphs of this, and I copied the first 10 for our workshop. The terrible beauty of the slum. You can find her in the group of beautiful thugs and two fast girls congregating on the corner and humming the latest rag, or lingering in front of Wanamaker's and gazing lustfully at a pair of fine shoes displayed like jewels behind the plate glass window. Watch her in the alley passing a pitcher of beer back and forth with her friends, brash and lovely in a cut-rate dress and silk ribbons. Look in awe as she hangs halfway out of a tenement window, taking in the drama of the block and defying gravity's downward pull. Step onto any of the paths that cross the sprawling city, and you'll encounter her as she roams. Outsiders call the streets and alleys that comprise her world the slum. For her, it is just a place where she stays. You never happen onto her block unless you live there too, or have lost your way, or were out on an evening lark seeking the pleasures yielded by the other half. The voyeurs on their slumming expeditions feed on the lifeblood of the ghetto, long for it and loathe it. The social scientists and the reformers are no better with their cameras and their surveys, staring intently at all the strange specimens. Her ward of the city is a labyrinth of foul alleys and glooming courts. It is Africa Town, the Negro quarter, the native zone. The Italians and Jews engulfed by proximity disappear. It would it is a world concealed behind the facade of the ordered metropolis. The not yet dilapidated buildings and decent homes that face the street hide the alley tenement where she lives. Entering the narrow passageway into the alley, one crosses the threshold into a vacuous, disorderly world, a place defined by tumult, vulgar collectivism, and anarchy. It is a human sewer populated by the worst elements. It is a realm of excess and fabulousness. It is a wretched environment. It is a plantation. It is the plantation extended into the city. It is a social laboratory. The ghetto is a space of encounter. The sons and daughters of the rich come in search of meaning, vitality, and pleasure. The reformers and sociologists come in search of the truly disadvantaged, failing to see her and her friends as thinkers or planners, or to notice the beautiful experiments crafted by poor Black girls. So that's the novel, or this amazing novel. So you can see how powerful it is to write about a place and create myths. We're not saying like make everything up, but in fact, a lot of poets do the opposite. But they kind of find, that's not what a myth is. A myth is not making everything up. All right, so all right, let us continue. So I have an entire workshop on Haiboons and Utopia and imagined places that I will let you look at. So I talk about Haiboons a lot in that. Um, the only thing I want to say is, in Western popular thought, we think that Haiboons are just 17 syllables, 575. Actually, in Japanese tradition, classical traditions, it's the fewer syllables, the better, 17 max, but you don't want to cut so many syllables that sounds weird. Um, and then haikus always have images, like image, like remember we talked about image and the breath, like things that you imagine. Um, so like the image of waking up in the morning when the sunlight hits your face and you already sunburnt, that's an image, something you can tangibly imagine and or feel. The image of walking into an empty warehouse might be another one. Um, and then the last thing is a seasonal reference. So when it comes to the major project for this workshop, it is to um, know that haiku always includes a seasonal reference. So no 2 days of summer are the same, right? No 2 days of winter either. But even how different things experience summer is different. And as poets, we have the pleasure of observing that. Another thing I want to just mention here quickly is that haiboons are prose plus a haiku. So it's like writing, descriptive writing, travel writing plus a haiku. And the haiku can go before, in the middle, or after. And you'll want to remember this for our main project of this workshop, which is the Poet's Notebook. So you're going to be combining like literal writing, descriptive writing, nonfiction with poetry. So, another thing that we are kind of movement in poetry that's worth noting is cinema verité. So, a series of documentaries that use technology and observation to kind of reawaken and re-explore the world. Documentary is a very cool subject because in a world where we feel like we know everything, documentaries blow that open. And they do so with this style of like raw filmmaking, where instead of making films in studios, technological advancements allow for portable cameras and portable audio equipment and portable lighting. So filmmakers take to the streets to create their documentaries, and often the documentaries have multiple subjects. So what I like to say is that it's a form of cinema that moves in the direction of life. Of like, it's something, if there's a turn of events, this camera is going to follow that turn of events. And it's that thread of realness that brings the film together. And if this was a class, we'd spend 1 week watching each of these films, which are amazing. And you could, I linked them in the document. But a couple of things I want to note here is that when you're making a film, there's 1,001 ways to get your point across. So that's kind of exciting for us as poets because like we could use language, we could use sound, we could use rhythm, but we could also use description, we can use jokes, we can use arguments, we can use found language, we can cite other poems. There's 1,001 ways to kind of make a film. And so verité kind of exemplifies that for us in a very beautiful way. Another thing that I want to highlight about cinema verité is there's often a discussion about whose truth is more valid, or it often engages different forms of knowledge, often informal forms of knowledge that are undervalued. So like in Nadia es Inocente, it's about punks that live in like the wastelands created by capitalism in the 60s and 80s in the 80s, at a time when buildings were being burned to collect insurance money in the Bronx. There were just people were living out of destroyed, ruined, bulldozed buildings, getting clothes out of giant heaps of trash that the first world has discarded in these fields. And it's just a really beautiful film. But it kind of looks to punks, these youth who do drugs and live freely, carelessly as thieves um, and lovers of music from over the pond. um, it looks to them as a source of knowledge. Um, and so think about in when we're writing about place, who can we give our platform to as poets? Who can we give voice to who usually does not have a voice? Who in Santa Barbara does not usually have a voice? So that's cinema verite. Um, And another thing about cinema verite is that it's not afraid to go on side quests. So you'll often see that these sometimes there's usually not like a wholesome story arc for these films. Instead, it's just kind of like a durational experiment um, that is then compiled, and often they have original soundtracks that use a lot of gets into my next one, field recordings. So cinema verite, one of the big innovations, I think, is like they don't see technology as like a distraction or a limitation or as artificial even. Instead, a way it's a way to help us celebrate human life and activity on this earth. So, and I think we see this with like influencer culture of influencers figuring out how to use social media like a form of capitalism that capitalizes on human relationships in a way that nothing ever has before. And they figure out, hey, like there's a way to make money off of this and also like be really funny. And that's idealization I realize of influencer culture, but um it shares that celebration of life that verité really captures. And then environmental planning is another source of poetic exploration about place. And I include that in our um, packet. And what I would like to say about that is that there's traditions in urban planning where exploring this that recognize that you can explore cities infinitely. There's an infinity of ways to explore a city, much like there's an infinity of ways to explore poems and write poetry about places. So this is a big tradition in poetry, and our kind of Venn diagram middle figure of urban planner and poet is Baudelaire. So Baudelaire is often cited and studied in urban planning programs. Um, Map making. So poets, as we see with concrete poetry, kind of make maps and use typography to illustrate or to make meaning of places. So we see this with like the slice, where um, buildings are kind of understood vertically. You know, if you make a poem that's like a slice, like the visual equivalent of like the middle, lower and middle image in this slide, what would that look like? And then also design, a big part of urban planning is aesthetic, you know, making things beautiful. And there's kind of an argument about beauty. You know, does beauty look like Beverly Hills, or does it look like Echo Park? Or does beauty look like the Hollywood Bowl, or does it look like a street fair? So design is core principle in urban planning. Um, and then I kind of group this all under like what I call translation. So one, like if you don't know another language, learn another language. It will add so much to your life. There's nothing like speaking to someone in their native tongue and in their mother language. And when you do, people are gonna love you for it. All right. So some of the things, so a lot of urban planning is like kind of discussion of data, translating it for us and what it means. It's about making connections, you know, between and using associative logic to make those connections. So that all overlaps with translation, you know, and poetry. And then also research. So a big, you know, big part of urban planning is what it is the research. So when you're making your poems, you can look to urban planning research and California EPA, the national parks, the you know, public websites for different beaches and look and learn about what's already been written about these places. All right. So for this workshop today, there are there's three exercises that I want to go over with you before we go. So I'm a little tired, so I'm going to kind of go through these a little quickly. So um, the first exercise, there's three on here. We're only going to do two. Um, is to rev do what Roberto Santiago did in Life of Gomorrah, that first poem that I read. Um, think of a think of a painful experience, or think of someone else's painful experience, and try a time and place where you were hurt, and then kind of flip the narrative to make it an empowering story. So this is something that a lot of poets do is they revise the meaning of a place or the meaning of an experience. And one way to do that is by adding to the backstory, giving us more backstory. So backstory is a nice place to start, as we saw with Life in Gomorrah, because it's vast. And often when we're told something or something happens to us, we have a small sliver, we only have a sliver of backstory. But the kind of the more backstory we can give, the better. I also want you for this revision to source more facts. So the mind really likes facts. And I'm not asking you to make up things, but I am asking you to critically think about what facts are already supplied and what facts could you supply that you can add. So in the life of Gamora, what facts do we get that are not in the original story? We get the fact of their friendship, that she was looking back, Lot's wife, Eddie, was looking back at her friend. We get the fact that we get that her name was Eddie. So those two facts help us kind of revise our beliefs about a place. And then the one thing I want you to do in this exercise is to depict a moment. So a specific moment in time. All right. So a specific experience, not like the experience of surfing, like you when you surfed on January 23rd, 1997, it's a moment in time. So for this exercise, I just want you to write like 100 to 150 words and or more and submit it. The next exercise I want you to do is so I'm going to just go over the second one, is to make your own myth. So think of your favorite lines from your favorite movie, your favorite book, your favorite TV show, or all the above. So make that list for yourself. You're going to need it, girl. Make that list. Then I want you to swap out local history or local facts for those beloved lines. And so the example I gave of this is like a personal example, and it's very empowering when you realize that you can do this all the time. And you finesse it so that it makes sense, but having this like kind of wealth of favorite lines, you can kind of plug it in at opportune times in your poems. So when I did this recently for my novel. So I grew up in the Inland Empire, which is got its name from being a midway point between Colorado steel reserves and the coast. So it's kind of like the midway between them. And it was given a very generic name because the US did not want enemy forces to know exactly where it was. Um, this was a time before satellite imagery. And it this was also in response to Japanese fascists attacking Pearl Harbor. So the US government and army relocated natural resource development to the Inland Empire rather than Pearl Harbor. So that's historically where it gets its name. In my novel, I make it up. And I say that the name is actually a reference to a 1940s manga named Haichiko that was about a small dog. And it was popular uh, in a time somehow popular and very different from other mangas of the time, which were melodramatic. And Haichiko had sparse dialogue, Spartan cityscapes, and kind of really poignant depictions of friendship. In fact, the name the Inland Empire references a specific line from that manga. Cat, wherever you are, peace be with you. So I invented and made my own myth about the Inland Empire rather than propagate war propaganda. And one of the reasons I do that is because in Sans Soleil, one of my favorite films, the one I mentioned earlier, um, there's actually that line, "Cat, wherever you are, peace be with you." And there's also a discussion about kamikaze. So not all kamikaze were volunteers. And one of the kamikaze pilots actually kept a diary, and in it he said, "I'm doing this." I get emotional thinking about it. But he said, I'm doing this in hopes that you all will make Japan the great nation of my dreams, of our dreams one day. That you will go on after this war, this horrible war, and make this country the country we always hope for. So I always get emotional thinking about it. But so that's the reason I changed it is like to kind of change the narrative about from this place, which is the Inland Empire now has over 1 billion square feet of warehouses, and there were zero warehouses when I was born there. And so it helps kind of change the narrative from it being kind of military, propagandistic World War II to something a little bit more subversive, queer, and modern. So once you kind of figure that you can kind of do that as a poet, it's actually a really powerful tool. And it's not like you're making stuff up. You're just you're using myth in a modern context, which is really cool. All right. So the main project for today is to invite you to create a poet's notebook. You won't be have to do this for the this week's work, but the poet's notebook is really what this whole workshop is about. Um, so you can say poets keep notebooks and they keep notebooks of places, and there's an infinite number of ways to keep a notebook. Yes, you can say that. But I've studied the different notebooks that poets I love use, and there's patterns about how they think about a place and track their thoughts and record their thoughts about a place. So they often engage in projective verse so freely. So they have like they mix prose and poetry in their notebooks. So they have a mix of like descriptive writing, travel writing, meditations, and also um, poetry, little bits of and fragments of poetry, much like similar to how what we see in like haibuns. The poets' notebooks often are dreamy, associative in their logic. They're using language to explore. To give you an example of this, what if you wrote a poem that began with the line, Santa Barbara is so extra, or Santa Barbara is so lame, or Santa Barbara is so bougie, or Santa Barbara is so like freaking fantastic. So just by saying like freaking fantastic, extra, boring, lame, you're using language to kind of provoke, explore, situate itself in our imaginations in certain situations. Um, so that's what I mean when we use language to explore. All right. And you see how the poets get pretty creative in this week's reading with that. And a big part of a poet's notebook is you don't sit down knowing what you think already and you try to prove it on the page. It's not scientific, it's not calculated. Instead, you let meaning accumulate through different entries across time. So you're using your entries themselves as ways to explore, and you let meaning accumulate organically on its own. And I guarantee you, if you have enough entries, it will. You don't have to sit there and be like, this is what Santa Barbara is. Proved it. Done, son. Never have to think about it again. That's the opposite of what we want to do. Poets' notebooks often incorporate found text. So text found things that from the world, like the commercials and songs and observations and transportation and stuff like that, transit names and the names of places. You'll find that the names of places are kind of help give us part of our ink that makes a poem on the page. Seasonal references are important. Multiple voices, as we discussed with epic poetry, mythical poetry, and verité. We're incorporating people who normally don't have a voice. We're incorporating people whose that we don't know, whose voices are in our heads, or in our hearts, you know. And then they're often fragments. Poets' notebooks are like fragments, and we honor their fragmental nature by stitching them together in unique ways that recognizes their autonomy and individuality. So sometimes the stitches are messy, sometimes they're clotted, sometimes they're very elegant in how it's done, and there's an organic feel to this. So look at some of Robert Haas's notebooks, entries, and CS Gizcoms, and you'll see kind of how this all pans out. And so for the third, so I invite you in this workshop to start your poet's notebook and when it comes to thinking about place. So our third and last exercise for this workshop is to create a panorama. So this is the third exercise, panorama, and there's different parts. So, and it's pretty fun. So, like we saw with Al Oyo or with Saidiya Hartman's depiction of the slum, uh, we can create a poet's notebook first by creating a panorama. So think of three people you love, or three people. Think of three people. One that you love, one that you noticed today for the first time, and one that you know at a distance, like a cashier or a bartender or someone like that. Then write about them. For the next part of your panorama, I want you to describe three spots in Santa Barbara or whatever city you would like to write about. One that's your happy place, like your therapy place. Another that's crowded as fuck. Where in your town is crowded? Even if your town has like one gas station, there's a place like Carpenter has what, four gas stations, 10,000 people. And yet there's still places where it's like super crowded. Write about that. That's part of what makes that place a place, like Lucky Llama or Linden, like places like that. And then think of one place that's iconic that you think of. Anyone who says that place name will think of this, like Carpinteria, the beach, the campsite. So I've gotten into like a little, not trouble, but people have read my work and been like, huh, when I don't include iconic places and when I write about places, people will be like, "Oh, where's the canyon, bro?" So it's kind of like the terms of engagement when it comes to this subject is we have to write about iconic features, and we have the pleasure of writing about iconic features. So then I want you to add one or two profound lines to give us a sense of scale. And I kind of detail this a little bit in the guide for the poems. Maybe you'll use one of the poem lines that you cultivated in that list of favorite lines. This is where you can start sprinkling them. Then for this next part, I want you to describe the moving city. So describe public transit, describe the waves, describe traffic patterns that you observe, describe animal behavior, the way that crows move around here or the parrots that you might see in LA, you know, describe the city as a moving thing. Then I want you to use place names. I want you to, if you don't know a place, look it up on Google Maps. Those names are magic. And then I want you to gather found text. So text that you see in commercials, that you see in billboards, that you see in restaurants, that you see in slogans that people use, maybe at UCSB, at our own school. I want you to use that and add it to your panorama. So what's cool about the panorama is that you can now produce a poem by moving in any of the ways that we've explored in this workshop. Boop, boop. Well, that's it. It's like pretty late and this is pretty long. Thanks everyone for hanging in there, and I hope you learned a lot today. And please enjoy the poems that you're going to read this week.